Hey guys, let me tell you something. When most people think about ancient Egypt, they probably imagine grand pyramids, the Sphinx, and mighty pharaohs living in lavish palaces, right? Sure, all that stuff is cool, like really cool. But if you think that's the whole story, then you might want to pull up a chair, because the reality of daily life in ancient Egypt was, well, a little less glamorous. Sure, they had some impressive monuments, but the rest of their lives? Let's just say it wasn't all champagne and chariot races. Take food, for example. Now, I'm sure you've seen the movies where everyone is feasting on endless platters of exotic fruits and roasted meats. The tables are overflowing with fine wine, and the meats are tender and juicy. But here's the thing. In ancient Egypt, most people didn't eat like kings. Most of the population lived on a pretty simple, if not somewhat repetitive, diet. You wake up early, maybe it's hot and dusty already, and you probably just get a bowl of bread and some beer for breakfast. Not even a nice, rich stout, just the kind of beer that's more like liquid bread. That's how they started their day. Bread and beer, which was basically the staple of everyone's diet. And for lunch? Yeah, probably more bread. But this time, maybe with some vegetables like leeks or onions or maybe even some lentils. Ooh, exciting. And don't even get me started on the meat situation. Sure, rich people got their fair share of meat. Goats, sheep, maybe a chicken or two. But if you were just an ordinary Egyptian, meat was a luxury. You'd be lucky to see meat more than once a week. Most people survived on a plant-based diet, which sounds all nice and healthy, except when you realize that you'd be eating the same few things over and over. Bread, lentils, vegetables, maybe some fish if you were near the Nile. But that's basically it. Doesn't exactly sound like a gourmet experience, does it? Now, you might be thinking, okay, that doesn't sound too bad. At least they had bread. But here's the thing. Bread was a huge deal. You could even say it was sacred. That's how important it was to their culture. There were even priests who were in charge of baking bread for the gods. I mean, imagine that, a priest dedicated to bread. Sure, that sounds like a cushy gig, but you know they had some serious pressure on them to get that loaf just right. And if you ever did get your hands on a nice loaf of bread, don't think you were eating it with butter or jam like we do today. No, no. The bread was often dipped in oil or maybe served with some vegetables or pickled stuff, which might sound kind of fancy, but also feels like the most basic meal ever. And let's not forget about those luxuries that the rich folks enjoyed. Things like honey, for example. Sure, honey is sweet and delicious, but that's also a pretty expensive treat. So even if you managed to get a taste of that, you probably weren't putting it on toast. You'd drizzle it over some fruit, or maybe use it to sweeten your beer. So the next time you're slathering your pancakes with syrup, just think about how in ancient Egypt, honey was a rare treat. Yeah, they weren't exactly living the high life when it came to food, but at least their homes were cozy, right? I mean, come on, they had some of the most impressive architectural feats in history. Surely their homes must have been something to behold. Well, again, it's not exactly what you might picture. Most Egyptians lived in modest houses made of mud brick. These homes were small and simple, with a few rooms at most. The walls were usually whitewashed and the floors, well, they were often just packed earth. Not exactly the hardwood floors you'd find in a modern home. And if you were lucky enough to have a rooftop terrace, you could enjoy the cool breeze at night. But during the day, it was probably a pretty stifling place to be. And let's not even talk about privacy. If you had a family, you were probably all crammed into the same space. So there's no need for a private time when you're all living on top of each other. And for those who lived in the cities, the noise and the dust were constant companions. The streets were lined with open-air markets where merchants hawked their wares, from pottery to food, and the sounds of people haggling filled the air. You'd think it was all bustling and exciting, but in reality, it must have been exhausting. You're trying to go about your day, but every corner you turn, there's someone trying to sell you something. And the air? Well, it wasn't exactly fresh. The dust from the roads would have been thick, and the smell of animals and human sweat probably made the street smell like a combination of farmyard and a public bathhouse. Speaking of bathhouses, let's talk hygiene for a minute. You know how we take daily showers, and you probably have a whole skincare routine that you follow religiously? Yeah, that didn't really exist in ancient Egypt. Sure, the rich folks had access to bathhouses, but they weren't the kind of luxurious spas we're used to. These bathhouses were more like communal spaces where people would wash off the grime of the day, and even then it wasn't like they had modern soap. Instead, they used oils and perfumes to cleanse themselves. The concept of a deep clean wasn't really a thing, so you can imagine how it felt to step out of a bath smelling like oil and sweat. It was probably a bit of a shock when the only way to freshen up was with a few spritzes of some overly fragrant perfume. But even with all of these small discomforts and inconveniences, Egyptians did have some luxuries that were surprisingly cozy. For instance, after a long day of work in the fields or doing whatever job you had, you'd likely unwind in the evening with a small meal and some wine. Sure, it might not have been the gourmet feast you dream of, but sitting down with a little food and drink, watching the sunset over the Nile, probably wasn't the worst way to end a day. The cool evening breeze, the sound of the river, the chatter of neighbors, it all must have created a cozy atmosphere. Just imagine being in your little mud brick home, having a sip of wine, and relaxing after a long, dusty day. It might not have been much, but it was something. Then, of course, there were the oddities of ancient Egyptian travel. Now, you might think that being such a powerful civilization, they had this amazing system of roads and transportation. But that's not really how it worked. Sure, the rich could afford to travel in style on boats or in chariots, but for the average person, traveling was an exhausting and uncomfortable process. Long trips would have meant hours or even days of walking, sometimes through harsh desert conditions. And don't even get me started on the food you'd bring with you on those journeys. If you were lucky, you might pack some dried fish, bread, and maybe a little bit of fruit. But forget about the luxurious snacks you might pack on a modern road trip. Instead, you'd be munching on stale bread, trying to keep hydrated, and praying you didn't get a sunburn. It wasn't exactly the vacation we dream of today. So you can see, daily life in ancient Egypt wasn't all it's cracked up to be. Sure, they had their moments of grandeur, but the truth is, their lives were filled with the same mundane struggles and discomforts we face today, just in a much hotter, dustier environment. And the worst part, they probably didn't even have a good cup of coffee to get them through the day. Can you imagine? So now that we've gotten a glimpse of how exhausting and uncomfortable traveling in ancient Egypt could be, let's shift our focus to something a little closer to home: food. Now, when most people picture the diet of an ancient Egyptian, they probably imagine an extravagant feast, with platters piled high with exotic fruits, roasted meats, and Of course, giant loaves of fresh bread. After all, Egypt was the land of the Nile, right? The river gave them fertile soil, which surely meant they had the best produce, right? Well, not exactly. In reality, the average Egyptian's diet wasn't nearly as glamorous as that. Sure, the elite had access to rich meals, but for most people, it was a pretty monotonous affair. Think bread, lots of bread, and sometimes some fish. Oh, and don't forget about the occasional lentils or onions. But don't get too excited. These weren't the kind of onions that would make a chef in a modern restaurant do a double take. No, these were humble, everyday onions, grown in the dirt and probably a little bit gritty, if you didn't wash them properly. Not exactly the stuff of feast, is it? Bread, for example, was a staple of the Egyptian diet, but not the fluffy, soft kind you might find at your local bakery. Oh no, ancient Egyptian bread was dense, so dense, in fact, that it was likely more of a brick than the airy, warm loaves we know today. And if you're wondering how they could make bread so dense, let me tell you, they weren't using any fancy bread machines. Instead, the ancient Egyptians used simple ingredients, mostly flour, water, and a bit of yeast. But without the modern-day convenience of electric ovens or professional techniques, you can bet that some of those loaves turned out more like doorstops than anything you'd want to eat. And forget about butter or jam. The bread was pretty much your meal. And if you were lucky, maybe you'd have some honey or date syrup to spread on top, but only if it was a special occasion. And speaking of fish, it's not like the Egyptians were living a coastal dream with an endless supply of fresh fish. Sure, they had access to the Nile and could catch some fish, but these weren't the kind of fish that would make you think, wow, this is a 5-star meal. These fish were small, often dried or salted to preserve them, and generally pretty tough to eat. They weren't the delicate, flaky fillets you might find in a fancy seafood restaurant today. Instead, they were more of the chew until your jaw hurts variety. So, when you think about the classic Egyptian diet, don't imagine feasts fit for a king. Imagine a lot of dry, dense bread and some fish that probably required a lot of chewing. Yum. Now, let's talk about how these folks actually lived day to day. The common Egyptian wasn't lounging around in lavish, air-conditioned homes like we might imagine when we think of ancient royalty. No, they lived in simple, one-room houses made of mud bricks. And if you're picturing an airy, cool space, you're probably going to be disappointed. These houses had small windows, which meant very little airflow, especially in the brutal heat of the Egyptian summer. The floors were typically dirt, so they weren't exactly the kind of floors you'd want to roll around on. And forget about plush carpets. Your bed was probably just a mat on the ground, if you were lucky. For the most part, the average person would have spent their days in a very, very basic setting with a roof that kept the sun off them, but not much else. And let's not forget the heat. Have you ever stepped out into a summer day that made you feel like you were walking straight into an oven? Well, that was pretty much the daily experience in ancient Egypt. During the summer months, temperatures would soar well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine working in that heat all day, hauling bricks, carrying water, or doing whatever else you needed to do just to survive. And because the Nile River wasn't exactly around the corner from every house, you'd often have to fetch water from a well or even walk down to the river. Now, this might sound refreshing, but carrying heavy pots of water for miles isn't exactly the kind of refreshment most people are after. And let's not even get into the fact that if you weren't near the river, you'd have to settle for drinking from a murky well, probably full of who knows what. That's not the kind of thirst quencher that inspires confidence. Of course, no day in ancient Egypt would be complete without some work, and for most people, this meant physically demanding labor. You weren't going to be lounging around sipping iced tea and reading a good book. You'd be working in the fields, tending to crops like wheat and barley, or you might be building monuments or tombs, depending on your profession. And let me tell you, building those pyramids was no easy task. Imagine hauling massive stone blocks up ramps in the scorching sun. Doesn't exactly sound like a relaxing afternoon, does it? Sure, there were probably some breaks here and there, but with the kind of work they were doing, those breaks were probably few and far between. The people who worked on the pyramids, for instance, were skilled laborers, but that doesn't mean they had it easy. They were working with tools made from copper, which means they weren't exactly cutting through stone like a hot knife through butter. No, these were slow, grueling tasks that required a lot of precision, and while they were working to build something monumental, it was hardly a glamorous job. If anything, it was exhausting and repetitive, and in between the work, they probably didn't get much rest, given the demands of their job. And even when they did get a break, it wasn't exactly the kind of relaxation we imagine today. The concept of leisure time in ancient Egypt didn't mean sitting on the couch with a remote control. No. Instead, it might have meant playing a game of Senet, which was a board game popular in Egypt. But you're not talking about a fast-paced, exciting game like Monopoly. Senet was a slow, strategic game that could drag on for hours, depending on how long it took to figure out the moves. And if you lost? Well, you probably didn't have the luxury of a consoling bowl of ice cream to make you feel better. Instead, you'd just return to your dusty home and get ready to repeat the same grueling routine the next day. But hey, they did have some comforts, at least in theory. The wealthy Egyptians, for example, had better living conditions. Their homes were bigger and more comfortable, and they could afford luxuries like soft furniture, fine linens, and, most importantly, cooling devices like large fans made from papyrus. They could indulge in perfumes and elaborate baths, and their meals were far more varied, featuring meats, fruits, and delicacies that would make today's chefs jealous. But these comforts were reserved for the elite. For most of the population, life was far less cushy. So, when you think about life in ancient Egypt, try not to get too swept away by the idea of pyramids, pharaohs, and grand feasts. For the average person, life was more about surviving than thriving. It was about enduring long days in the heat, working with limited resources, and finding small moments of relief where you could. The food was simple, the jobs were tough, and the comforts were few and far between. And even though they were living in a civilization we now admire for its achievements, for most people back then, it was just another exhausting day in ancient Egypt. So let's keep going and explore more of what life was actually like in ancient Egypt, especially for those who weren't living in the palaces or the temples, but just trying to make it through another exhausting day. Remember, the elite had their cozy lives with fine meals and luxuries, but most people were grinding away in ways that we wouldn't even imagine today. First, let's talk about food. You're probably picturing elaborate feasts with roast meats, fruits, and exotic spices. Well, for the average person, the reality was a bit different. The typical meal would have been incredibly basic and repetitive. And unless you were one of the few who could afford a wide range of foods, it wouldn't have been something to get excited about. Breakfast for most people was simple. Sometimes just a piece of bread, often stale, maybe with some onions or a little garlic to add some flavor. It wasn't like they could stroll down to the local bakery for a fresh baguette. If you were lucky, you might get some fruit, like dates or figs, but that was a rarity for most. Lunch wasn't much better. It might have been a small serving of lentils or beans, possibly with a little fish or dried meat, if you had the resources, but it wasn't a lavish spread, just enough to get you through the day without passing out from hunger. And don't get me started on the bread. The Egyptians were serious about their bread, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it a delicacy. It was usually coarse and made from barley or emmer wheat, which wasn't exactly the finest flour you could get. You might have found it in all kinds of shapes, sometimes round, sometimes flat, but you could bet it wasn't going to be the kind of bread you'd find at a bakery in Paris. They also had beer, but not the cold, refreshing kind we might imagine today. This beer was thick, almost porridge-like, and was often made from barley. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd drink with your friends to unwind after a long day. It was more of a daily necessity to quench thirst and get some calories. Speaking of getting some calories, let's talk about how food was prepared and cooked. Most people didn't have access to fancy kitchens with modern appliances. They had simple clay ovens or even open fires to cook on. Cooking in ancient Egypt wasn't about the finesse of a five-star chef. It was about survival. Imagine standing over a fire, stirring a pot of barley soup or grilling a fish, all while the heat of the day made everything feel 10 times more uncomfortable. It wasn't a leisurely process. It was a daily task just to get the food ready for the family. Oh, and let's not forget the cleaning process. Washing the pots and pans was no easy feat. There were no dishwashers back then. You had to scrub away at everything by hand, probably in the sweltering heat, and without a good place to wash either. The river might have been your best bet, but it wasn't always convenient or pleasant. Now, as for the comforts of daily life, well, if you were living as a commoner in ancient Egypt, your comforts weren't about luxury. They were more about small, momentary escapes from the heat and discomfort of daily life. Most people lived in simple mud brick houses, which were great at keeping the heat out, but not so great at keeping you cool. The roof was often flat, so in the evenings you could get some fresh air, but during the day it was like living in an oven. But hey, at least you had the river, right? The Nile was more than just a source of water. It was the lifeblood of Egypt. If you had access to a boat, you could get a little breeze while traveling across the water. For those who could afford it, a fan made of papyrus or palm fronds might have been a luxury to cool yourself down. But for most people, a fan was just a dream, and a simple piece of cloth might have been the only thing standing between you and the unbearable heat. Let's talk about the work, though. Ah, yes, work, the kind of thing that dominated every waking hour for most Egyptians. And it wasn't like they had the luxury of working a 9 to 5. Nope. Work was dictated by the seasons and the needs of the state. If you were a farmer, you'd spend long days in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending to your crops. The work was grueling, and the hours were long. Imagine waking up early to catch the first light, working through the scorching heat of midday, and then continuing well into the evening to finish your chores. You couldn't just take breaks whenever you felt like it. There were no air-conditioned offices or comfortable lounges to retreat to. You just worked, and you kept working. And don't think you had much say in the matter either. If you were a farmer or a laborer, you were often at the mercy of the seasons and the Pharaoh's demands. The Nile's flooding meant that the land was fertile and ready for crops, but it also meant that the harvest was a race against time. If you missed the window to plant or harvest, you risked having nothing to eat for the next year. This constant pressure, day in and day out, would have worn people down mentally and physically. And that's just the life of a farmer. If you were one of the many who worked on the massive construction projects, whether it was building temples, tombs, or the mighty pyramids, you'd probably be spending even longer hours in even worse conditions. Working on a pyramid wasn't exactly a cushy job either. Sure, we like to romanticize the idea of building these monumental structures, but the reality wasn't nearly as glamorous as the movies make it out to be. It was exhausting, repetitive labor. You carried heavy stones, cut massive blocks, and worked in the heat of the day with little more than a rough meal to keep you going. There were no high-tech cranes or machinery, just human hands and muscle. And don't think there were any fancy workers' rights back then. You showed up, did your job, and hoped for the best. In fact, workers weren't even paid in cash. Instead, they were given food, beer, and maybe a small amount of goods for their families. So, you weren't exactly living it up as a pyramid builder, even if you were part of one of the most famous building projects in history. And the jobs weren't all grand projects either. For most people, work was far more mundane and far less glamorous. Picture being one of the people who had to tend to the city's waste. Yep, someone had to deal with all the filth that came from a society without modern plumbing or waste disposal systems. You could bet that most ancient Egyptians didn't have the luxury of toilets like we do today. Instead, they had pits or simple holes in the ground, and of course someone had to clean that up. Not exactly a fun job, is it? It was dirty, smelly work, and it never really stopped. Someone always had to be on duty to keep things from getting too out of hand. Let's not forget the fun jobs like being a scribe. Sure, it might sound prestigious, being able to write in one of the world's most advanced systems of writing, but let's be honest. How much fun would it be to sit there for hours on end, writing out long lists of grain distribution, tax records, or other tedious matters? It wasn't exactly the glamorous role you'd expect, especially for the lower-ranking scribes who had to deal with the grunt work. Your life might have been full of ink stains and constant corrections. But then again, even when you weren't working, life wasn't much of a break. For most people, there was no real concept of vacation. You didn't have weekends off or the ability to escape to a beach for a little R&R. Life was all about survival. You worked hard to get your food, to make sure your family had enough to eat, and to keep up with the demands of the gods. It wasn't exactly a life of leisure. Sure, there were festivals and religious holidays, but those were few and far between. And they weren't exactly the same as the time off we enjoy today. And let's not forget about the entertainment, if you could call it that. Sure, the ancient Egyptians enjoyed music, dance, and storytelling, but these weren't the kinds of distractions that would take your mind off of your exhausting daily life. Entertainment back then wasn't about binge-watching a Netflix series or grabbing a drink with friends. It was about sitting around a fire after a long day, maybe singing or playing a lyre, and listening to tales that probably didn't offer much respite from the grind. So yeah, when you think about the life of a typical ancient Egyptian, it wasn't all grandeur and mystery. It was a tough existence, filled with work, discomfort, and small pleasures that didn't do much to take the edge off the grind. So next time you see a pharaoh's tomb or a magnificent pyramid, just remember, for most of the people in ancient Egypt, their lives weren't nearly as glamorous as history might have you believe. They were just doing their best to survive in a world that was unforgiving and exhausting. And when the day was done, they probably went to sleep, tired and sore, just waiting for the next day to begin. So, here's the thing. After a long, grueling day of back-breaking labor, the ancient Egyptians weren't exactly hitting the town for a night out. The reality of their lives, well, let's just say, it wasn't as glamorous as what the glossy photos of their monuments might lead you to believe. Sure, there was a lot of ceremony and grandeur, but most people were too busy with their daily grind to really soak in the whole royal vibe. You know, those iconic images of the pyramids, the temples, the statues. Yeah, all of that was happening, but not for the everyday person. If you were one of the common workers, most of your life was spent toiling under the hot sun, probably trying to avoid stepping on a scorpion or getting caught in a sandstorm. After that, you'd return to a modest, often cramped home. Nothing like the expansive tombs or grand palaces you see in documentaries. Most people's homes were little more than mud brick houses with thatched roofs, and when the wind picked up, you could expect a good amount of sand to sift through the cracks in the walls. And if you were lucky, maybe you'd get a bit of peace after that exhausting day. But who are we kidding? You had a bed, but it wasn't the kind of thing you'd sink into and forget about the troubles of the day. No, most people slept on simple, hard wooden pallets, if they even had a mattress. It wasn't about comfort, it was about surviving the night, so you could wake up and do it all again. So what did a typical day really look like for someone living in ancient Egypt? Well, let's break it down. First off, you'd wake up, probably before the sun rose because, let's face it, there wasn't a snooze button in ancient Egypt. The roosters might have been your alarm clock, but even if they didn't crow, you would still rise. No matter how tired you were, there was always work to do. If you lived in a village, maybe you were one of the countless laborers helping to build a temple, or perhaps you worked on the riverbanks, where most of the economy revolved around the Nile. You'd probably be knee-deep in mud by the time you were done, hauling rocks or digging trenches for irrigation. And if you were lucky enough to work in a craft or trade, like pottery or weaving, it wasn't like you had a cozy workshop to hang out in. No, you probably sat in a corner of your home, dealing with dust and heat, while making goods that would be traded for food or other necessities. If you were one of the farmers, well, you had the luxury of working in the fields. The good news? You didn't have to worry much about weather patterns. The bad news? The soil in Egypt wasn't exactly fertile on its own. It relied heavily on the annual flooding of the Nile to keep it rich and viable. So every year, you were at the mercy of whether the river's flooding would be enough. Too little, and your crops wouldn't grow. Too much, and your crops would be ruined by floodwaters. It's a miracle anyone managed to make a living off of farming at all. Food was simple, and not always great. We tend to romanticize ancient meals, maybe imagining grand feasts with exotic spices and sumptuous dishes. But the average Egyptian worker wasn't sitting down to anything too exciting. If you were a farmer, your daily diet likely consisted of bread, onions, and some kind of watery beer that was more like a soupy gruel than the crisp stuff we're used to today. Oh, and if you had access to fish or maybe some fruit, that was a real treat. But honestly, many workers barely saw any variety in their meals. For them, eating was about sustenance, not enjoyment. It was fuel, plain and simple. And when you're working 12-hour days under the burning sun, your sense of taste is probably the last thing on your mind. On a good day, maybe you'd get a bit of stew made from lentils or beans, but don't get too excited. It wasn't like the Mediterranean feasts we dream about. This wasn't the kind of food that left you satisfied for hours. More like something that barely kept the hunger pangs at bay long enough to get you through the day. So, you'd go back to work after your meal, probably dealing with the same grueling tasks until the sun set. Now, speaking of the sun, let's not forget how harsh it could be. The Egyptian heat was relentless, and not exactly the kind of weather you'd want to endure for hours while hauling stones or harvesting grain. It wasn't just the physical toll it took either. It was the way the sun seemed to make everything harder, more tiring, more uncomfortable. Your clothes didn't help much either. Most Egyptians wore simple linen tunics, but let's just say they weren't the most breathable garments. After a full day's work, you'd be covered in dirt, sweat, and probably a good amount of body odor, too. And unlike today, there weren't any refreshing showers or baths to wash it all off. Water was precious, and if you were lucky, maybe you'd have a chance to rinse off at a public bathhouse. But more often than not, you just had to get used to it, that is, until you fell into bed. Your uncomfortable, probably sand-filled bed. And sleep? Well, sleep in ancient Egypt wasn't much of a relief. Again, no mattresses here, just a hard surface to lay on. Most of the time, you'd sleep in whatever space was available to you, maybe next to your family or with a few others if you lived in a communal setting. It wasn't about privacy or comfort, it was about surviving. The bed probably wasn't even big enough for you to stretch out properly, but after such a long day of physical labor, you probably just passed out from exhaustion, hoping that tomorrow wouldn't feel quite as unbearable. But hey, every once in a while there was something to look forward to. Maybe there was a small festival or religious celebration where you could enjoy some music or dancing. But even those weren't much of a break. They were full of prayers, sacrifices, and long ceremonies. Sure, you could get a bit tipsy from the beer, but that didn't change the fact that the next day you'd be back to the same old grind. So yeah, these little diversions weren't much to get excited about. They didn't change the fact that life for the average ancient Egyptian was about as exhausting and uncomfortable as you could imagine. And you know what's wild? Even if you managed to survive the grueling work, the hot weather, and the food that barely kept you going, there was always the possibility of illness to contend with. Without modern medicine, even the simplest ailments could become life-threatening. A scrape could get infected. A bad cough could kill you. And if you did get sick, well, you probably just have to hope it passed, because treatment options were limited to things like herbs, prayers, or the occasional bone setter. So yeah, if you survived a day of work, you were still gambling with your health. It wasn't exactly the kind of life that screamed cozy, that's for sure. But the thing is, for all the hardships, the ancient Egyptians did have some small comforts. If you were lucky enough to have a decent home, you might have a place to sit in the shade and relax for a moment, And while the food wasn't amazing, at least it was filling. And when the day was over, you could sleep, even if it wasn't the most comfortable sleep, because really, that's what they had to look forward to. The little moments that broke up the monotony. It wasn't grand feasts or grandiose celebrations. It was simple things, a cool breeze, a bit of shade, and the satisfaction of having survived another day. So next time you're looking at those incredible monuments and thinking about how amazing life must have been for the people who built them, just remember, life wasn't all that glamorous for most ancient Egyptians. In fact, it was pretty darn tough. But before we go any further, let's talk about what these ancient Egyptians actually ate. Because, surprise, surprise, it wasn't just all bread, beer, and the occasional fish or goat. Sure, the average worker didn't have a lot of choice in the matter, and meals were more about sustenance than pleasure, but there were a few things in the Egyptian diet that might surprise you. For starters, bread. If you've ever been to a fancy bakery and marveled at all the artisan loaves, well, just know that the Egyptians were baking bread long before any of us started obsessing over sourdough. But let's be real, the bread they had was not the fluffy, warm, Instagram-worthy kind. No, their bread was dense, coarse, and often mixed with coarse grains like barley or emmer wheat. And I'm sure it wasn't fresh either. It was probably more like a giant hardened cracker that you had to gnaw on for hours. If you were lucky, you might have had a piece that was slightly less stale. But hey, it was food. Bread with some kind of spread or dip was the mainstay of most workers' diet, often accompanied by beer. Yeah, beer. But this wasn't anything like the hoppy cold brews you're thinking of. This was a thick porridge-like drink made from fermented barley. Not exactly something you'd sip leisurely at a rooftop bar with friends. No, this was the beverage of choice for ancient Egyptians, a drink so thick that you had to drink it through a straw to avoid getting chunks of bread in your mouth. Charming, right? And it wasn't like you could just run down to the local farmer's market to pick up some fresh fruit and vegetables. If you were a laborer, your access to those kinds of luxuries was pretty limited. Sure, there were onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce available, but they were rare, especially for someone working long hours under the blistering sun. They probably had some fruit, too, dates, figs, and pomegranates, but unless you were at the top of the social ladder, don't expect to see those every day. If you were fortunate, you might get a bit of stew, which usually consisted of lentils or beans cooked in a broth, but that wasn't guaranteed. Vegetables were nice to have, but they weren't the main event. The main event was bread and beer, always. Of course, the wealthier folks had it a bit better, but their meals weren't exactly what you'd call glamorous. I mean, it wasn't like they were feasting on roast pigs or anything. They probably had more variety, but it wasn't like they were living it up on the level of some lavish modern dinner party. The pharaohs and high-ranking officials had access to more elaborate foods like roasted meats and exotic fruits, but again, it wasn't like they were gorging on anything particularly fancy. Even they had to deal with the occasional blandness of Egyptian cuisine. And we haven't even touched on the cleanliness factor. No fancy sanitizing wipes or hand soap back then. If you were a worker, it's not like you could take a shower at the end of the day to scrub off all that dust and sweat. Most people would just splash water on their faces and hope for the best. If you were lucky enough to have access to a public bath, you could soak yourself in a pool of water that, frankly, wasn't all that clean. But who could blame anyone for being okay with that? The alternative was dust and filth sticking to your skin like glue as you worked through the heat of the day. So, what did you do? You just dealt with it. Sure, it wasn't the most comfortable existence, but it was survival, and that was the most you could hope for. Now, let's talk about what the Egyptians did when they weren't toiling away at their work. Because, believe it or not, they did have moments to relax. Sure, they weren't lounging on fluffy couches or enjoying a Netflix binge, but they did have some ways to unwind, even if it wasn't quite as glamorous as we'd imagine. They didn't exactly have movies or social media, so instead, they would pass the time with storytelling, music, or games, board games, to be specific. One of the most popular games was Senet, an ancient Egyptian board game that involved a mix of luck and strategy. It's not exactly a fast-paced action game, but it did provide a distraction from the everyday grind. If you weren't into games, you could always kick back and listen to some music. Musicians, though not as revered as they would be in later periods, were still a fixture in Egyptian life. They played a variety of instruments like flutes, harps, and drums. But even this wasn't a full-on concert experience. If you were a worker, you'd probably hear the music from afar or catch a performance on a rare day off. Still, it was a nice change of pace from the constant hum of labor. But for the average person, what really made the day feel like it had any value was the knowledge that they could retreat into the modest comfort of their home at the end of the day. Again, it wasn't the kind of home you'd see on the cover of an interior design magazine, but it was home. It had walls, sometimes made of mud brick or reeds, and a roof to keep the sun and rain out. The furniture, if you could call it that, was basic at best. You probably had a mat to sleep on, maybe a few pieces of clay pottery, and a few woven baskets for storage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And sometimes that's all you really needed. You didn't have a bed with a fancy duvet or an adjustable mattress, but you had a place to sleep, and that was something. It wasn't like you had to worry about cleaning your house every other day. Dust was a permanent fixture. The best you could do was sweep it out with a broom made of palm fronds. The heat was another issue, of course. It wasn't like modern-day air conditioning was an option. No, the ancient Egyptians had to make do with what they had. A lot of houses had small courtyards where you could sit and enjoy the breeze, provided it wasn't one of those scorching hot days when the air felt like a giant oven. On those days, you might have just stayed indoors, hoping the thick walls of your house would keep some of the heat at bay. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make you appreciate the small moments of respite, even if it was just for a few minutes before you had to get back to work. And speaking of work, let's not forget about the toll it took on people's bodies. The idea of working every day, day in and day out, under the harsh sun, was no joke. It wasn't like modern jobs where you could just sit at a desk in an air-conditioned room. No, the Egyptians were out in the open, lifting stones, building temples, or working in the fields. The work was physically demanding, and it wasn't exactly kind to your body. You might end up with calloused hands or sore muscles, but what choice did you have? You worked because you had to, and that was the reality of life back then. And yet, despite all the hardships, there was a sense of pride in what you did. You were part of something bigger, something that would last for centuries to come. But in the meantime, You were just trying to survive another day. Travel was another luxury that most Egyptians didn't get to experience often. The idea of hopping on a plane and heading off to a distant city was as foreign to them as the idea of flying cars might seem to us today. For the average person, travel was limited to nearby towns or, if you were lucky, a trip down the Nile. But this wasn't the kind of leisurely cruise we picture when we think about river travel. No, this was slow, hot, and uncomfortable. You might have spent hours or days in a cramped boat, with the sun beating down on you the entire time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the best way to get from point A to point B. And let's not even get started on the idea of vacations. If you were a worker, the idea of taking time off to relax just wasn't a reality. Most people work 6 days a week, with only 1 day off, and even then that day was probably spent tending to your personal needs, like fixing up your home or taking care of your animals. There were no luxurious spa days or beach resorts to escape to. It was just work, work, and more work. If you were lucky, you might have had a few hours to yourself at the end of the day, but that was about it. The ancient Egyptians were tough people. They had to be. They didn't have the comforts that we take for granted today. Their lives were defined by long hours, hard labor, and modest rewards. But in those small moments of relaxation, in the simple pleasures of food, shade, and the quiet satisfaction of finishing a hard day's work, they found a sense of comfort, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. So, as we were saying, the life of an average ancient Egyptian worker was nothing short of exhausting. It wasn't a bad life per se. It wasn't the hardest life either, but it certainly wasn't what we might consider comfortable. Sure, they had food, shelter, and their health was often managed with remedies we would find laughable today. But when we think of comfort in the context of today's world, we're looking at things like soft pillows, air conditioning, and pizza delivered to our door while we binge-watch something on Netflix. Now, let's think about that contrast for a second. Instead of a plush mattress, imagine a hard reed mat. Instead of a cool breeze flowing through a living room, you're wiping sweat off your brow with your handkerchief as you kneel down in the dirt to work. And when you're hungry, you might get a basic stew of lentils, bread, and maybe some vegetables. But hey, no pizzas, no gourmet meals, and certainly no sitting down to enjoy a cup of iced coffee. And that's just the routine. The daily grind of work didn't exactly offer much time for relaxation either. You wake up before the sun rises, probably because you're expected to start your labor shortly after. You might walk miles to your job site if you're lucky enough to be working on one of the grand construction projects like the pyramids, or you might find yourself digging ditches, working in the fields, or performing some other manual task for hours on end. There's nothing glamorous about any of this. Work could be grueling, the weather often unforgiving, and the hours long. You were essentially on call for the whole day, minus the hours it took for a meager lunch and maybe a short break in the midday heat. And when the workday finally ends, you're probably too exhausted to think much about doing anything else. Sure, there's food, maybe some entertainment, if you count sitting around a fire talking with your family or friends as entertainment, but that's pretty much it. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the best comforts we have in life today, like a good night's sleep or a solid meal, were probably at the top of the list for ancient Egyptians too. But the execution? Not so much. Let's dive a bit deeper into food, because, as we all know, food is an important part of life. But I think we have to be careful about romanticizing the simplicity of ancient meals. In modern times, we have such variety at our fingertips. You could have anything from sushi to spaghetti at almost any given moment, even if you're living in the most remote place in the world. In ancient Egypt, on the other hand, food was simple and not necessarily the most appetizing by today's standards. Workers were often given bread and beer as part of their meals, but don't get too excited. This wasn't craft beer or artisanal bread. No, no. This was a thick, slightly sour beer that was far more like a barley soup with some alcohol mixed in. It was nutritious, sure, but let's not pretend it was something you'd write home about. The bread was typically made of barley or emmer wheat, often flat and hard, with little in the way of seasoning or variety. If you were lucky, you might get some onions or garlic to flavor it up, or some dried fish or vegetables to accompany the dish. Still, you're looking at a far cry from the variety of foods we'd expect today. For those who worked the land, the food they ate was heavily dependent on the harvest. A bad crop could mean an extremely lean year. The grain, so crucial for everything, was usually turned into beer or bread, leaving very little left for anything else. Vegetables like onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, and beans were common, but they're not exactly something that will make you stop and say, "Wow, this is a feast." For meat? Well, that was a luxury for most. Workers could occasionally have small portions of fish or fowl, but this wasn't an everyday occurrence. If you were living in a more urban environment like Thebes or Memphis, you might have access to more food variety, but for the majority of workers, it was pretty repetitive. So, yes, they ate, but it was food that was nutritious in a very basic sense. It filled them up and kept them going, but no one was savoring a 5-course meal. Let's talk a little more about those small comforts. Ancient Egyptians had one thing going for them at least: the sun. The desert climate might have been harsh, but it also meant plenty of sunshine and warmth, which is great for morale, especially if you weren't working in the heat of the midday sun. But what about when it's too hot, or too cold, or too windy? How did the average person get by when they weren't stuck out on a field or some construction site? It's not like they had air conditioning or even the luxury of sitting in front of a fan like we do. But what they did have were simple joys like shade, a cool breeze when they could catch it, and the occasional good meal with their family at the end of a long day. But there was always work to be done. The concept of time off, as we understand it, didn't really exist. Even if you weren't working, you were either maintaining your home, caring for animals, or doing some other task necessary for survival. There was no such thing as unwinding after work in the way we think of it today. You didn't have your weekends free to relax. The closest thing to a break might have been spending some time with your family or socializing at a local gathering place, but those moments were brief. Of course, even with all this, there were moments of respite. Ancient Egyptians, being human, found ways to make their lives a bit more bearable. There were festivities, local markets, and religious festivals. The temples were a great place for people to gather, and they were often filled with music, dancing, and food. If you were lucky, maybe you'd be part of one of these occasions where for a brief moment life would feel a bit easier. But again, these were special events, not the daily grind. Now, let's not forget the houses. If you were lucky enough to have a decent home, it was a small practical structure made from mud brick or reeds. These homes weren't exactly palaces, but they did offer some protection from the elements. At the end of the day, you could retreat into the comfort of your home, where you'd have your family around you, the warmth of a fire, and the closeness of loved ones, while modest, might have been the greatest comfort some workers had. But let's be clear, don't expect cozy fireplaces with plush couches. The homes were bare bones, usually only furnished with a few basic items like mats, baskets, and some clay pots. All in all, life in ancient Egypt wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the kind of cushy existence we might expect. Comfort, in the sense that we think of it today, was a luxury, and most Egyptians didn't have that luxury. Their lives were defined by a daily struggle to meet their basic needs. But in those brief moments when they could sit back, share a meal with family, or find some shelter from the sun, they found a small slice of what we would consider comfort. The rest was just hard, unglamorous work. It might not have been the most exciting, and it might not have been filled with the little indulgences we take for granted. But in many ways, the simplicity of it all was probably what kept them going. Life in ancient Egypt was a far cry from the conveniences of today, but maybe that's exactly what made it easier to survive. All right, so we've talked about life at home and how it wasn't exactly a spa retreat. But let's move on and see how Egyptians managed to get through their daily grind. Now, we've already established that life wasn't exactly about lounging around on plush furniture or sipping on cocktails in a shaded courtyard. But what did they do with the little time they had for rest? How did they unwind after a long day of whatever it is they did all day? Well, let's dive into it. First off, it's important to note that Egyptians weren't exactly going to have the same experience of a day as we might today. We live in a time where most of us can leave work, go home, relax, and throw on our favorite TV show to zone out. The ancient Egyptians didn't exactly have Netflix. They didn't even have an internet connection to mindlessly scroll through for hours. So, what did they do when they weren't working? Well, it's safe to say that they made the most of what little they had, but it wasn't exactly a glamorous time. Picture this: the heat of the sun beating down on you all day as you worked in the fields, carried stones, or wove baskets. When the workday finally came to an end, it wasn't like you could jump into a cool shower and relax in air-conditioned comfort. Instead, you probably trudged home, tired and grimy from a long day's work. And if you were lucky, you could crawl into your humble home and get some rest. If not, you would simply settle on a mat on the floor, hoping to catch a few hours of sleep before starting it all over again the next day. And that's the thing. There were no big, lavish palaces to retreat to, no comfy lounge chairs or king-sized beds waiting for them at the end of a long day. For most Egyptians, home was more of a place to store your belongings and sleep at night. The furniture was basic, maybe a few mats on the floor, a few baskets for storage, and maybe a few pots to hold food or water. It wasn't anything fancy. They weren't spending their days looking forward to luxurious indulgences. No, for them, a good day was just one where they survived. But let's not paint it all as completely miserable. While they might not have had the same kind of comforts we have, Egyptians still knew how to make the most of the little things. Take food, for example. The typical diet of an ancient Egyptian wasn't all that exciting, but it was usually enough to keep them going. Their meals were mostly composed of bread, beer, and some basic vegetables and legumes. Sounds thrilling, right? But even with a diet that seems pretty plain by modern standards, it was enough to get by. Now, we can't exactly say that their food was gourmet, but it was an essential part of their routine. And despite the lack of fancy dishes or exotic spices, there was something comforting about having a simple meal at the end of the day. The bread they ate was probably homemade, made with grains that were locally grown. The beer wasn't the kind we drink today, but it was still a fermented beverage that gave them a little buzz at the end of a long day. In fact, beer was so important in Egyptian culture that it was considered a staple, especially for workers. Imagine finishing up your workday, sitting down to a bowl of some stewed lentils or vegetables, and sipping on a cool mug of beer. It wasn't a lavish feast, but it probably felt pretty good. When we think about food in ancient Egypt, we tend to focus on grand feasts held in royal palaces or the meals of the elite, but that's a far cry from what most Egyptians actually ate. The truth is, for the majority of the population, their meals were simple, practical, and about survival more than indulgence. It wasn't about enjoying the complexity of flavors or savoring the richness of a multi-course meal. It was about sustenance, about making it through another day without starving. It's a far cry from the kind of food experiences we have today, but at the time, it was probably the most comforting thing they could look forward to. And then there's the issue of hygiene. Now, don't get too excited. The ancient Egyptians weren't exactly known for their luxurious bathing rituals, at least not on the scale we might imagine. Sure, they had access to the Nile, and they were pretty good about keeping themselves clean by using the river for bathing and washing. But it wasn't like they had access to hot showers or luxurious baths in the way we think of today. Instead, you might find yourself standing in the Nile, splashing water on yourself in the hopes of getting rid of the sweat, dust, and grime that accumulated during the day. After all, there weren't any of those fancy soaps or shampoos we have today, just some basic oils and scrubs to help with cleaning. On the rare occasions when they did manage to get a good scrub, they might use oils and perfumes to mask the scent of sweat. And let's not forget the very real problem of lice and other pests. It wasn't uncommon for people to have to deal with these issues as part of daily life. In fact, one of the most common ways to get rid of lice was by using a type of fine-toothed comb to try to pick them out of your hair. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. And with the heat and the lack of modern hygiene products, it was probably just something you got used to. After all, a little lice wasn't going to stop you from getting through the day. As far as comfort goes, we can't say that the Egyptians had a lot to work with. But what they did have, they made use of. The homes they lived in were designed to keep them cool in the heat. But that didn't mean they were comfortable by today's standards. Most homes were made of mud brick and had very little in terms of furniture or decoration, but they did have some relief from the oppressive heat. The thick walls of mud brick would help keep the inside of their homes cool during the scorching Egyptian summer. It wasn't air conditioning, but it was something. They would also use woven mats to cover the floors, which helped make the hard surfaces a little more bearable to sleep on. What's interesting, though, is that despite all these inconveniences, the Egyptians still found ways to find a little joy in their lives. Their daily comforts, though basic, were enough to make life bearable. They knew how to adapt to the harsh conditions they lived in, and even if their homes weren't grand palaces, they found peace in the little things. A simple meal with family, the cool breeze from the Nile, the quiet moments at the end of a long day. These were the small comforts that helped them make it through the grind of everyday life. And in the grand scheme of things, maybe that's exactly what made life in ancient Egypt bearable. They didn't have much, but they made the most of it. But what about travel? Surely there was some form of escape, right? Well, yes and no. While Egyptians weren't exactly jumping on airplanes or taking weekend trips, they did have ways of getting around. Traveling in ancient Egypt wasn't as easy as hopping into a car and driving to the next town over, but it wasn't impossible either. Most travel was done by foot, boat, or animal, mainly donkeys and camels. The Nile River was especially important in this regard, serving as a natural highway for people to travel along. You could take a boat ride down the river to get to different parts of the country, but it wasn't exactly the most luxurious way to travel. The boats were simple and often uncomfortable, and the journey could take days, depending on where you were headed. Still, there was something oddly comforting about the idea of a river journey, don't you think? The gentle sway of the boat, the sound of the water lapping against the sides, and the warmth of the sun as it set over the horizon, it probably felt like a peaceful escape from the grind of daily life, even if it was a bit bumpy. It wasn't like you were cruising in a yacht, but it was a mode of transport that allowed people to explore their world in a way that wasn't completely miserable. The river, with its gentle flow, offered Egyptians a chance to leave their homes behind, even if only for a while. And yet, despite the ancient Egyptians having access to such a majestic river, their lives were still pretty confined. The majority of Egyptians didn't travel far from home. Most of them stayed within the general area of their village or city. The idea of travel for leisure, like we think of it today, was practically non-existent. The few who did travel were usually priests, officials, or traders, people with some degree of privilege. So, while it wasn't exactly easy to get away from it all, there were still some moments of respite that came with the ability to travel, even if those moments were fleeting. Even though their daily life wasn't filled with grand adventures, the Egyptians still managed to find comfort in their own way. It wasn't about lavish luxuries or extravagant escapes, but more about making the most of what little they had. So in the end, it wasn't about whether or not their lives were perfect. It was about finding peace in the simplicity, even when the going got tough. The ancient Egyptians lived through hardships we can barely imagine, yet they managed to find moments of comfort and joy in their daily routines. Life wasn't easy for them, but it was real. And in its own way, that might have made it more meaningful. So, let's talk a little more about what an average day looked like for a typical ancient Egyptian worker. Not the priests, not the nobles, but the everyday laborers who were the backbone of the whole system. These folks didn't get to sleep in palatial tombs or feast on lavish banquets. Their daily routine was more about staying alive and getting the basics done. And trust me, there was something strangely comforting in that. You wake up early, really early. The sun rises, and that's your cue to get moving. No alarms, no snooze button. It's just the sun and the heat that will soon be unbearable. The first thing you do is probably pray. Yeah, it's not what you were expecting, but the ancient Egyptians, like most societies, started their day with some kind of religious devotion. It was kind of like a ritual you couldn't skip. No matter if you were a high priest or a humble worker, You had to pay your respects to the gods before anything else. For most people, this meant simple offerings or chants, though the truly devoted might have made a bigger production of it. Now, after that quick spiritual warm-up, you're off to work. Depending on your job, this could mean anything from breaking your back in the scorching heat, lugging huge stones across the desert for the Pharaoh's latest pyramid, to scraping the bottom of a Nile boat as it's pulled along the river. You're not just digging and hauling, you're also performing tasks that nobody ever remembers when they talk about ancient Egypt. It wasn't all hieroglyphic writing or royal duties. There were plenty of tasks that were repetitive, mundane, and mostly forgotten by history. Yet, in those everyday struggles, there was an odd sort of stability. The work itself was exhausting. You're carrying stones, you're baking bricks, you're mixing mortar, or maybe you're grinding grain. Whatever it wasn't glamorous. No air conditioning, no fancy break rooms. It was sweat, dirt, and frustration with the heat. Speaking of heat, let's talk about how miserable it could get. Egypt, being one of the hottest places on earth, meant that any laborer would have been constantly fighting the temperature. The Nile might have been a lifesaver, but when you were in the middle of the desert, it was just heat, dust, and more heat. So, during the hottest parts of the day, you might find shelter under a palm tree or in one of the shaded work areas. If you're lucky, you might get a simple meal brought to you. And I'm not talking about five-star dining here. No, your lunch was usually just bread, maybe some onions or garlic, and a little fish or beans if you were lucky. The bread was thick, sometimes a little too tough, but it did the job. It's probably a little different from what we might think of when we imagine food in ancient times. But hey, it worked. It was filling, and that's all that mattered. Now, water. If you were working near the Nile, you'd at least have the benefit of water, though not in the way you might think. There was no clear access to cool, clean water like we expect today. The workers would rely on whatever water was available, probably pulled from the river, but often a little murky. And while we tend to take water for granted in modern life, for these ancient laborers, it was a precious resource, one that might have been more rationed than we realize. So, getting that drink during your break? It wasn't guaranteed. You might have had to wait for someone to bring a jug of water to you, all while you're standing under the blazing sun. But hey, at least you could look forward to your evening, right? Well, not exactly. After a day full of hard labor, the workers would head home, though home might not have been much more than a mud brick hut or a simple room with little more than a mat on the floor to sleep on. So, when the sun finally sets and the day's work is over, you get to enjoy your evening with, well, not much. The cozy domestic life, for lack of a better term, wasn't much of a retreat. You wouldn't be sipping wine in front of a roaring fire. Instead, you're probably eating whatever little food you could scrape together, maybe sitting with family, or, if you were fortunate enough, enjoying a brief moment of peace. Let's take a moment to think about what comfort meant in a society like ancient Egypt. It wasn't about fluffy pillows or heated blankets. It wasn't about lounging around in soft clothes or enjoying endless luxuries. No, it was about finding those tiny moments of rest in between all the hard work. Maybe you had a comfortable spot on the floor. Maybe your roof didn't leak when it rained. And if you had a little fire, you could cook your food and keep warm. That's as cozy as it got. But even then, it was all relative. Now, let's talk about travel for a second. You know how we think of travel today. Maybe a nice vacation or a leisurely weekend getaway. That wasn't really a thing back then. The average Egyptian wasn't hopping on a plane to visit the next city or country over. Travel was reserved for the elite, like priests or wealthy traders. It was all about necessity. People traveled for work, for trade, and occasionally for religious reasons. But travel for leisure? Forget it. That wasn't something most people could afford to do. If you did travel, it was probably down the Nile on a boat. And let me tell you, it wasn't as relaxing as it sounds. The boats weren't luxury yachts. You weren't sipping cocktails on the deck while enjoying a warm breeze. No, it was work. You were probably rowing, hauling goods, and dealing with all sorts of uncomfortable situations. So, while the idea of ancient Egyptian travel might sound romantic, it was more about getting from point A to point B than enjoying the ride. Still, for those few who were able to leave their village, even if just for a day, there must have been something satisfying about that. A break from the routine. The ancient Egyptians may not have had the same idea of comfort that we do, but there was a strange sense of stability in the simplicity of their lives. Sure, they worked long hours under brutal conditions, but there were also moments of respite, a cool breeze near the river, the quiet of the evening, a family meal shared at the end of the day. Now, imagine the feeling of relief when you finally made it home. Sure, your home was probably tiny, cramped, and not much to look at, but it was yours. You could rest your weary body, eat your simple meal, and maybe, if you were lucky, sleep without worrying about what would come the next day. It wasn't much, but for many, that's what comfort meant. It was about finding peace in the simplicity of life. Maybe it wasn't the perfect life, but it was a life that was lived, and in the end, that's probably what mattered the most. This was the reality for the majority of ancient Egyptians. Their lives weren't filled with luxury or grand adventures, but they made do with what they had. They found comfort in their routines, in the small moments of peace that came at the end of the day. Sure, their world was filled with challenges, hardships, and endless toil, but there was still something undeniably human about it. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made their lives more meaningful than we give them credit for. So, next time you think about ancient Egypt, with its majestic pyramids and towering temples, just remember that it wasn't all about grand victories and royal feasts. It was also about the day-to-day grind, the simple acts of surviving, of finding moments of comfort in a world that was often anything but comfortable. The ancient Egyptians may not have had our luxuries, but in their own way, they made the best of what they had. So, as we've already established, the everyday life of the average ancient Egyptian was far from glamorous. Sure, you had your pharaohs, your priests, your grand monuments, but for most people, life was a routine of back-breaking labor and the quest for some semblance of comfort in an otherwise difficult existence. And when we talk about comfort, we have to remember that it wasn't the kind of comfort we think of today. There were no soft cushions, no AC, no comfortable chairs to sink into after a long day. No, this was comfort in its most basic form. Small things that made life just a little bit easier or more bearable. Take food, for instance. Ancient Egyptians had a pretty straightforward diet. They didn't have the luxury of endless options like we do now. No fridge stocked with a variety of ready-made meals or take-out options at the tap of a finger. Instead, their meals were simple, with bread and beer being the staple of their diet. And I'm not talking about the fancy artisanal loaves we have today. This bread was basic, flat, and a bit dry, but it was nourishing. It was a food that could be made quickly, cheaply, and in bulk. It wasn't about flavor or variety. It was about sustenance. Now, beer was probably the most important part of their diet, and I'm not talking about the ice-cold brews we sip while watching a game. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, more like a porridge than a drink. It was made from barley and water, often flavored with dates and other sweeteners. It wasn't carbonated, and it was consumed in large quantities, often with meals. For the common people, beer was so crucial that it was actually considered a form of payment. Yep, workers who built the grand monuments or worked in the fields were often paid in bread and beer. If you think about it, that's probably the most ancient version of a lunch break you could get. You go out, work under the harsh sun all day, and then get a hearty bowl of beer to quench your thirst and fill your belly. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. On top of the bread and beer, there were vegetables, fruits, and some meat, but it wasn't something everyone could afford. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and cucumbers were common in the Egyptian diet, as were various fruits like dates, figs, and pomegranates. But meat? That was a luxury. The common folk would have had access to fish from the Nile, and occasionally they might get a chicken or some goat, but most meat came from the wealthier classes. It's not that the Egyptians didn't enjoy a good lamb roast or a chicken stew, but the reality was that it was reserved for special occasions, or for those who could afford it. The rest of the time, people had to make do with the crops they grew and whatever they could forage or trade for. Speaking of trade, Egypt's vast network of trade routes helped bring in goods from across the ancient world. But even with that, the comforts that we take for granted were not easily accessible. There were no endless aisles of spices from the Orient or exotic fruits from the New World. They had what they had. And that's what made them appreciate the small comforts they could find. A warm loaf of bread, a glass of thick, sweet beer, a simple bowl of vegetables. For them, that was luxury. Now, moving away from food, let's talk about the home life. You might be thinking that an ancient Egyptian home was something grand, like the ones we see in movies or museums with marble floors and towering columns. But for most people, the reality was far more humble. Most Egyptians lived in small mud brick houses with roofs made of palm leaves or reeds. The walls were plastered, often with a smooth layer of whitewashed lime, and the floors were packed dirt. There was no real furniture to speak of. Instead, people would sit on simple mats or cushions and sleep on small wooden or reed beds. It wasn't exactly the lap of luxury, but there was something undeniably cozy about these homes. They weren't cold stone palaces, but rather modest spaces filled with warmth, both from the sun and from the family members who lived there. If you were lucky, you might have a small fire pit to cook your meals over or to keep you warm during the cooler months. And by cooler months, I mean the few weeks where the temperatures in Egypt might dip just below the boiling point of water. It's not like they were pulling out the blankets and cozying up for a winter's nap. No, the cold was just a slight chill in the air, one that was quickly forgotten once the sun came back up. But even with the simplicity of their homes, there was a kind of charm to the daily routines. Families would gather together for meals, sharing whatever they had, whether that was a thick porridge-like beer or a loaf of stale bread. The kids would run around, playing in the dirt or helping out with whatever chores they could handle. And while the work may have been grueling, there was still a rhythm to it. The same tasks, the same schedules, day in and day out. The comfort was in the predictability. You knew what to expect. You knew what your role was. You knew what was coming next. And when it came to travel, well, let's just say that it wasn't exactly like hopping on a plane and going to your favorite vacation spot. Traveling in ancient Egypt was a slow and difficult affair. If you needed to go anywhere, it was usually by boat or by foot. If you were traveling on the Nile, you might have the luxury of a boat, but this wasn't a yacht. It was a small, simple vessel that took you down the river at a leisurely pace. It was a practical mode of transport, and one that would get you where you needed to go. But again, it wasn't glamorous. You'd spend long days drifting along the river, often in the heat of the sun, with little more than a small sail or a few paddles to keep you moving. But there were a few conveniences that made the journey a little more bearable. Travelers on the Nile had a roof over their heads. They had shade from the sun and a steady supply of water from the river. If you were lucky, you might even have some food and beer to sustain you on your travels. If you were lucky, that is. But for most people, it was about making do with what you had. Traveling wasn't about adventure or exploration. It was about getting from point A to point B, and doing it as efficiently as possible. If you were traveling on foot, it was even less comfortable. Ancient Egypt wasn't exactly the kind of place where you could find a nice road to walk on. There were no paved highways or well-maintained paths. Instead, you had to deal with the rough terrain, the heat, and the dust. There weren't any rest stops along the way, no convenient inns to stay in. If you were lucky, you might find a small oasis or a village where you could rest and refill your water skins. But more often than not, it was just you in the open desert, trudging along in the heat, hoping that you could make it to your destination before you ran out of supplies. Of course, for the wealthier Egyptians, travel was a bit more comfortable. They had access to better transportation, better food, and more comfortable accommodations. But even for them, travel was far from the luxury we enjoy today. There were no air-conditioned hotels or five-star restaurants along the way. They had to make do with what they had, just like everyone else. The only difference was that they had a bit more to work with. So, when you think about the daily life of ancient Egyptians, it's easy to get caught up in the grand monuments and the legendary kings. But in reality, the vast majority of people lived lives that were far more modest. They worked hard. They made do with what they had. And they found comfort in the little things, simple meals, cozy homes, and the predictable rhythms of daily life. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't luxurious. But it was their life. And in many ways, it was just as meaningful as anything we have today. When we look at ancient Egypt, we tend to focus on the grand structures, the pyramids, the temples, the tombs, and yes, those are impressive. But if you were a regular person living in ancient Egypt, your life was probably a little less glamorous. You might have woken up early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the Nile. You'd start your day not by visiting a palace or overseeing massive stone construction, but by dealing with the day-to-day grind that made up your humble existence. Now, food was a big part of that grind. Sure, the wealthy had their feasts, banquets that might have included everything from fish to dates to exotic meats and fine wines. But the average person, well, their diet was more basic. They relied on grains, mostly barley and wheat, which they used to make bread and porridge. Bread was a staple. Imagine it as the equivalent of our modern-day rice or pasta. Every meal had some form of it, and it was usually pretty plain. Maybe a little olive oil or honey drizzled on top to make it less boring. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and leeks were common too, and you'd likely have some lentils or beans in there for protein. If you were lucky, you'd get some fish from the Nile, or if you lived near the desert, maybe some game like birds or small mammals. Meat was a luxury, and for most people, it was a rare treat. Certainly not something to expect at every meal. But what about the drinks? Well, water was obviously the go-to, especially since the Nile was right there. However, beer was far more popular. It wasn't the beer you're thinking of, no cold bottles of lager or fancy craft brews. It was more like a thick porridge-like substance made from fermented barley. People drank it throughout the day. It was a way to stay hydrated, sure, but it also had some nutritional value, and for a long time it was considered the drink of the people. If you were lucky enough to drink wine, it was likely something reserved for religious ceremonies, high-class gatherings, or as a special treat. The average Egyptian, they were probably getting their fill of beer. Then there was the matter of the home. No one had the kind of sprawling, air-conditioned villas we're used to thinking about. In fact, many homes were small, simple structures made from mud brick, designed to keep things cool in the sweltering heat. If you were lucky enough to have a house with a roof, you'd spend your evenings trying to escape the oppressive warmth by lounging on a simple mat, maybe sharing some dried figs or a bit of bread with your family, and if you were feeling particularly adventurous, you might even eat your meal while lounging outside, beneath the shade of a palm tree or a small courtyard. But for the most part, homes were cramped, basic, and, dare I say it, pretty mundane. You'd get up early, eat your simple breakfast, and begin your workday. If you were one of the many who worked as a farmer, you'd probably spend your day tilling the soil, planting your crops, or tending to the livestock. If you worked as a scribe or an artisan, maybe you'd be carving intricate hieroglyphics or weaving baskets. But one thing was constant: the heat. Even in the early morning, the temperature would start to climb. So you'd get to work under the harsh sun, and as the day wore on, the relentless heat would press down on you, making every task feel just a little bit more exhausting. But here's the thing. Even though it was difficult and often uncomfortable, there was a kind of rhythm to it all. There was something comforting about the predictability of it. You knew when to get up, when to work, when to rest, and when to eat. Sure, it wasn't glamorous. There weren't any grand ceremonies for the average worker. But there was a certain coziness in the regularity. After all, when the end of the day finally arrived, you could sit down with your family, maybe share a small meal, and feel the warmth of the fire as the stars slowly began to appear above. You might not have had luxury, but you had comfort, of a sort. And let's not forget the role of travel. If you had to travel, well, it was going to be a bit of a hassle. Unlike today, where we can hop on a plane and be across the world in a matter of hours, ancient Egyptians had to rely on boats, donkeys, and their own 2 feet. The roads weren't exactly paved, and you had to contend with the heat, the dust, and the occasional sandstorm. But the upside? You were never really in a hurry. Most people weren't crossing vast distances in a day. It was more of a slow journey, like a series of small steps from one destination to the next. You'd probably camp out under the stars, making do with whatever food and water you had on hand. It wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't unbearable either. Again, there was a rhythm to it, a comforting pace that gave you enough time to rest, eat, and enjoy the journey, even if it wasn't the five-star vacation we picture today. Let's also take a moment to consider the small comforts that were available. It might not sound like much, but there were simple pleasures that helped people get through the day. The cool breeze off the Nile in the evenings, the warmth of the fire as you sat down for dinner, the feeling of the sand between your toes after a long day of work. These little moments, though often overlooked, were what made life feel just a little bit better, just a little bit cozier. And for those lucky enough to live near the bustling cities, there was the added bonus of trade. Traders from all over would come to Egypt, bringing with them goods from distant lands. Spices, perfumes, textiles, and other exotic items were available to those who could afford them. For the wealthy, this was an opportunity to indulge in luxuries. But for the average person, well, it was a chance to catch a glimpse of something new, something that could break the monotony of daily life. In the end, when we think about ancient Egypt, we often focus on the big, grand things, the pyramids, the pharaohs, the incredible monuments. But for the everyday Egyptian, life was a lot more, well, ordinary. Sure, it wasn't easy, but it had its moments of comfort. And in the end, those small comforts, whether it was a simple meal with family, a quiet evening by the fire, or the slow, steady rhythm of the workday, are what made life in ancient Egypt truly remarkable.